Welcome to Living the Bible, where we examine the Bible and church history to guide our everyday living. I'm Jason Conrad. This episode continues our series that began with the Exalted Christ poem in Philippians chapter 2, a passage that proclaims Jesus as pre-existent, fully divine, fully human, crucified, and then exalted. That hymn became a cornerstone of apostolic teaching, shaping how the first Christians understood and worshiped Jesus. Since then, we have talked about 4 different movements that diverged from that Christ hymn. It's not a lot of Christianities that we have evidence for. It's just 4 divergent movements in the first century. One of them, the Nazarenes, emerged before 70 AD, and they still affirmed Christ's divinity as described in the Christ hymn. The other 3, the Ebionites, Cerinthians, and Docetists, arose after 70 AD, and each in their own way found the message of that poem too hard to accept. In our last episode, we explored the Jewish roots in Judea, tracing how the Ebionites broke away from the apostolic teaching, eventually leading them to deny Christ's divinity and reject Paul entirely. Today we turn to the Gentile world, where the influence of Greek philosophy and mystical speculation created new challenges for the gospel. These Gentile groups didn't just deny or distort who Jesus was, they had to cut ties with the apostolic tradition found in that poem. They had to reject or rewrite the Gospels and eventually produce their own writings to support their ideas. In each case, they failed to grasp the central paradox of the Christ hymn, that the highest became the lowest, that the eternal God entered into human suffering, and that through the cross came exaltation. Another item to remember is that by the year 70, tradition says that all the original apostles had died, and only one remained alive, and that's the Apostle John. When you look at his writings in the New Testament specifically, you can see very clearly how he's writing against these Gentile ideas. Cerinthus appeared around 80 to 85 AD in Asia Minor, up where Ephesus is and the churches of Revelation are talked about. He blended Egyptian mysticism, Jewish religious ideas, and Platonic dualism all together to create a new type of Christianity. He couldn't imagine the divine Christ truly taking on flesh or suffering on a cross, as the Christ poem declares. His solution was to separate Jesus and Christ into 2 separate people, 2 separate beings. Epiphanius, writing around the year 375, says this about Cerinthus. He grew up in Egypt, he was trained in literature, claimed to have had revelations from angels, opposed the apostles, especially Paul, and said that it was not right to accept the epistles of Paul, calling him an opponent of the law. Tertullian, writing around the year 200, said, Cerinthus alleged that the world was made by angels and creatures below the supreme God, and that the law itself was given by angels. To maintain the divine Christ as untouched by matter, Cerinthus denied the virgin birth, and he made Christ a separate spiritual being who descended on the man Jesus at baptism and left him before the crucifixion. Irenaeus, writing around the year 180, said this, quote, he represented Jesus as having not been born of a virgin, but as being the son of Joseph and Mary, while Christ descended upon him at his baptism and then departed again before the Passion. Hippolytus, writing around the year 230, said this about Cerinthus' ideas. He said, Christ came down in the form of a dove and afterward flew off from Jesus. Jesus suffered and rose again, but Christ remained impassible, being a spiritual being. Cerinthus also denied that the supreme God created the world. Influenced by Platonic dualism, he believed matter was corrupt and that a lesser being, ignorant of the true God, created the cosmos. Irenaeus, again writing around the year 180, said, he asserted that the world was not made by the primary God, but by a certain power far separated from him and far inferior to the principal power who is over all, and that this power is ignorant of the God who is above all. This reflects the philosophical assumptions common in the Greco-Roman world of that time. So Philo of Alexandria, writing right around this time, says, quote, "It is not lawful to suppose that the supreme God comes into contact with any corruptible thing. God does not himself create, but he commands his logos as his instrument." The philosopher Plutarch, writing around the year 100, said this, quote, "It is impossible for a good being to produce anything bad, and matter being evil could not have been made by a good God. The world must have been fashioned by an inferior deity." Cerinthus embraced this framework and applied it to Christianity. He distorted the gospel to fit these Greek categories of thought. His version of Jesus and creation stood in direct opposition to the apostolic message that through him all things were made and the Word became flesh. He also knew that he had to break with the apostolic gospel and the apostles themselves. So Eusebius cites a Christian named Caius of Rome in the year 200. It says, "There are men who say that they themselves are Christians but are not. Cerinthus, who in Asia made use of revelations which he pretended were written by a great apostle." Epiphanius says this, "Cerinthus used only the gospel according to the Hebrews and called it according to the Hebrews. He rejected the apostle Paul completely, calling him an apostate from the law." And then you get this quote from Irenaeus. It says, "John, the disciple of the Lord, going to bathe at Ephesus, and perceiving Cerinthus within, rushed out of the bathhouse without bathing, exclaiming, 'Let us flee, lest even the bathhouse fall down, because Cerinthus, the enemy of the truth, is inside.'" Now, this dramatic story reminds us that John viewed Cerinthus as entirely outside of the apostolic tradition. It's a total breakaway from what we see in the Christ poem. Cerinthus knew that to hold his views, he had to reject Paul, use a different gospel, and fabricate apostolic-sounding revelations. His teachings directly opposed the message of the Christ hymn, and it's no coincidence that John's gospel, emphasizing the Word became flesh, was written right at the same time. The next group is the Docetism group. So whereas Cerinthus split Jesus and Christ apart, Docetism denied Jesus' humanity altogether. The name comes from a Greek verb that simply means to seem or appear. And their idea was that Jesus only seemed to suffer. He only appeared to be human. He was spirit and not flesh at all. So when you read John's letters, you can see him responding directly to this. In 1 John chapter 4, "Every spirit that confesses that Jesus Christ has come in the flesh is of God. Every spirit that does not confess that is not of God." In 2 John 7, "Many deceivers have gone out into the world who do not confess Jesus Christ as coming in the flesh." This denial spread in the 2nd century, and eventually writings were produced, Gospels and Acts were produced to reflect this docetic idea. So you have the Gospel of Peter, written late 1st century, early 2nd century, and in that Gospel it says, when Christ is on the cross, "But he kept silent as feeling no pain." The Acts of John in the 2nd century. "Sometimes when I walked with him, I would try to touch his body, but it was immaterial. He left no footprints on the ground." And then the Gospel of Judas, again, 2nd century. It says in a few different places, Jesus saying, "You will sacrifice the man that clothes me," meaning there's two separate entities. You can't touch the Spirit Christ, the Spirit God. You will sacrifice just the flesh that is covering him. Then you get this. "Often he did not appear to his disciples as himself, but he was found among them as a child." So he would take on different shapes and like a shapeshifter whenever he was in his ministry with his disciples. And then there's a large section in the Gospel of Judas talking about how far separate God the Father, the supreme God, is from the world and the creation of the world. It says, "There exists a great and boundless realm in which it is the great invisible Spirit." And then God creates angels out of this cloud. And eventually an angel is created named Saklos. and sackcloth is the one who says, let us create a human being. The Docetists produced writings to promote this worldview, but the early church quickly recognized them as something counterfeit. Serapion of Antioch, writing around the year 190, said, the writings which falsely bear the apostles' names we reject, knowing that such were not handed down to us. There you see a direct correlation to what we talked about a few podcast episodes ago on how the emphasis from Paul was that he was handing over and delivering to the churches what he himself received, this sense of apostolic tradition that he was passing on what he received from the early Christians. So Serapion is recognizing this, that these apostles, they're creating writings that sound like they're Christian. They're Gospels and Acts and Revelations. But when you read the contents of them, you recognize that they have gone astray altogether from the apostolic tradition of the early church. Ignatius, in his letters, also emphasized this. So when he writes to the church in Smyrna, he says about Christ, quote, he truly suffered, not as certain unbelievers say, that he suffered in appearance only. And then writing to the Trallians, Ignatius said, be deaf to anyone who speaks apart from Jesus, who was truly born, truly crucified, and truly died. So from the beginning, the church's message was built around a unified Christ, the divine Lord who became human, suffered, and then was exalted again. That's what you find in the Philippians 2 Christ hymn. And it's what the apostles received, and it's what they passed on as they established new churches. And in the first century, there's only 4 divergent groups from that Christ hymn. The first was the Nazarenes prior to AD 70, and even they upheld Christ's divinity while trying to continue to live out the Mosaic law. After the year 70, you get the Ebionites, who are the first group to deny Christ's divinity. And in doing so, they knew they had to reject the apostolic tradition and reject the apostles themselves. So they rejected Paul. They had the Gospel of Matthew already. They altered it, changed, and took out the first couple chapters to get rid of the genealogies and the birth narrative. The Cerinthians came next, somewhere around 80 AD, 80 to 85, and they split Jesus in 2, right? So you get the Christ who is divine and cannot be touched and cannot suffer, and then the man Jesus. And again, Cerinthus knew he had to reject apostolic tradition, and he himself again began to use a different gospel. It wasn't the same modified Gospel of Matthew that the Ebionites used. It was a different one he called according to the Hebrews, but had, again, the same type of manipulation done to it. And then the Docetists, who come later, and their writings begin to become prolific as you go into the 2nd century with the Gospel of Peter, the Acts of James, and so forth, the Gospel of Judas as well. They denied Jesus' humanity entirely. They could not fathom the idea of the supreme God becoming flesh, especially they couldn't understand the idea that he would be crucified. Only the Nazarenes of those 4 groups remained within the orbit of apostolic belief. The other 3 just couldn't accept the full paradox of the Christ hymn, that God became flesh and suffered for us. To defend their views, they had to break free from the apostolic tradition and the apostles themselves. They had to reject or alter the scriptures that were being written and already being circulated among the churches, and had to create their own writings under false names. But the true message still rings true today, the one that's been handed down generation after generation and received by Christians. Though he was in the form of God, he didn't consider equality with God something to be held on to. So he humbled himself even to death on a cross.